ADHD Rewired, episode 426. This is the podcast for those of us with really good intentions and a slightly wandering attention. I'm Eric Tivers. I'm a licensed clinical social worker by training and a coach by design. I'm your host, and I have ADHD. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. We are a community. We are wired for connection, and you are not alone. Go to ADHDrewired.com to learn how you can join us in our free and secret Facebook group. Get additional resources for every episode, including links to any resources we mention on today's show. You can support us on Patreon, sign up for our email newsletter. You can request podcast postcards to distribute to your clients and support groups. Learn all about our award-winning coaching and accountability groups. You can co-work with us in our Adult Study Hall virtual membership community. You can do all of these things by going to our website at ADHDrewired.com. We know that starting is the hardest part, so let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of ADHD Rewired. Today's guest is Patrick LaCount. Patrick is the Director of Practical Psychological Services in Fort Collins, Colorado, and specializes in the assessment and treatment of ADHD. Dr. LaCount completed his doctorate in clinical psychology at University of Wyoming, pre-doctoral residency at Duke University Medical Center, and post-doctoral fellowship at Seattle Children's Hospital. In addition to providing psychological services, Dr. LaCount is passionate about disseminating the latest science to the ADHD community and is a research consultant for the How To ADHD YouTube channel. Patrick, welcome to ADHD Rewired.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. So you do a lot of work with college students. Mm-hmm. I know that some of your focus has been on transition ages from college to adulthood. You've also done a lot of work around exercise. You've spoken about that balance between, support but not coddling. And you've also done some work around complementary and alternative approaches to ADHD. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for us to cover over the next 45 minutes or so. So let's get into it. So how long have you been doing this work with ADHD?
I think it's been just over 10 years now. Golly. Yeah, it's getting up there.
All right. And so you work with college students. What are you finding, especially now during, as we were now into year 2 of COVID, what are you finding have been some of the challenges facing college students with ADHD, especially during these times?
Boy, there's so much to that. On one hand, is COVID over? Is it becoming an endemic? Is it coming back again? We've gotten our hopes up and school getting shut down, open up again. Things are remote. Things are hybrid. And just, we all know with ADHD brains, just switching, like you could develop a system that it works for you. And then it's like, all right, come back to class again. Or all right, now go back home. And it's really hard to make that switch. So students are really struggling with that. There's the financial stressors as well. And I mean, with all of this, I think comes the anxiety and depression, which can exacerbate the ADHD. And sometimes that deserves us focusing on that first and foremost before we're able to get into organizational systems and things like that. So a lot of stress.
So what are some of the most common things that you see in your clinical practice?
I think a lot of people, it's, outside of diagnostic assessments, of course.
Is that a big part of what you do?
Yeah. Okay. That's a pretty big part of what I do. I'm sure in most states, there's just not a whole lot of specialists for adult ADHD and college student ADHD. It's kind of either, all right, well, let's just give you a script. And if that works, then that means you have ADHD. Or, well, if you weren't diagnosed in childhood, you don't have ADHD. Like I've heard it all. And so.
And just for people who are new to ADHD, just want to comment on something you just said, that idea that if we give you medication for ADHD and it works, speak to that for people who are new to this, because that is old thinking.
Yeah. So the way I explain it to people is that, first and foremost, it's a stimulant. So it feels good when it comes on. And especially if you've never experienced that before. Think about, a lot of us are coffee drinkers. That first sip of coffee in the morning is like none other. You're just like, yes,
it's amazing.
Like straight into the veins. So in the studies that they've done with this, they took I believe they were college students with and without ADHD. And they were both given stimulants, both given some kind of task to complete. And both groups self-reported, hey, I think I did better on these tasks on these stimulants. And when they actually looked at the data of performance metrics, those without ADHD did not improve. Those with ADHD did improve. And so just relying on that self-report experience of we think we improved because I felt better. Like think about when you complete a task, you get a hit of dopamine. It's like, that was right. And so even if you're doing the wrong thing, like I'm sure a lot of us have experienced in that hyper focus of like, I'm going down this alley, but it feels good. Those without ADHD can experience and then misattribute that positive experience to, I was more productive. So yeah, just because you feel like you benefited from it doesn't necessarily mean you did, nor does it mean that you have ADHD.
And I know in the ADHD world, which is why it's so important when you're doing an assessment, both for diagnosis and for treatment, is that it's not just you as a person with ADHD reporting on your symptoms.
Right. Yeah. You want to get what we call like a collateral reporter. So a teacher, a partner, a friend, did they notice anything different? We'll do that as part of the evaluation process for childhood. So we're not great childhood reporters because who is? Like, tell me about your behavior before the age of 12. I don't know. I have, so we like to get that. And yeah, sometimes we can have biased self views. So making sure we have as many viewpoints as possible. It helps make sure we have a more comprehensive look at things.
So I want to actually ask you that because I imagine that there would probably be a bunch of people who would be interested in this. So you are one of Jessica McCabe's advisors and the research consultant for the How To ADHD channel. Just curious if you could share a little bit about like what that actually means.
Yeah, no, it's funny because we were actually just in Washington recently working on her book that she's got coming out next year. So keep an eye out for that. And I was joking. I was like, we need to change my title to like Chief Executive Research Officer Extraordinary. Like, so I was in grad school actually at the time. And, I think it's maybe the second time a patient reference, I'm seeing these videos and really helpful. And it's a girl with ADHD, which we all know there's very little representation of relative to boys with ADHD. Like, I really like her stuff. And she thought of this and she thought of this. And I was like, she sounds pretty smart. All right. So I looked up some of her videos as just, all right, maybe I can refer this to clients, and was really impressed with what I saw. And I saw that she made a point of, making it relatable and personable, but also wanted it to be grounded in good research whenever that's possible. And honestly, just out of spontaneity, I was like, I want to be involved in this. And I emailed her basically saying, hey, I do this for a living, looking up research articles all day, every day. Do you want some free help? And so I had a talk with her at the time and we meshed really well. I liked her style, and researchers, scientists, we can be bad communicators. And it forced me to think about, okay, here's how we phrase things in the research community. And here's what you guys are experiencing. And, here's what we're researching, but here's what you want researched. And I really liked filling that divide between science practice or science and just the community for which we're working for, the way I see it. So yeah, basically she has questions for videos, has me, look over them. There's a team of us that help with that, and just making sure, okay, is this up to snuff research wise? Can we make it sound better? Should we use more scientific terms or should we use community terms? There's pros and cons to both of those. So just, supporting her in that way.
That's awesome. I have much respect for Jessica for how much effort she puts into making sure the information she's putting out there is not a bunch of BS, that it's credible, it's well researched. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, of course.
So what's some research that you've been kind of excited about lately, or you've been finding really interesting?
Ooh, I think it's complicated. So dietary research is interesting, but it's also a giant mess. But I think it's a promising area of research that people who are more specialized in that are trying to figure out, because for a litany of reasons, stuff that we find in tightly controlled studies doesn't generalize. And then when we ask people in more real world circumstances to report their food intake or how we manipulate them, people aren't great reporters in that domain. So, but I think it's something I get asked about at least every week, about changing something in the diet and could that yield effects. And we really just don't have great answers for that right now. It's possible, but science is still out unless you have a very clear allergic reaction to something.
I usually tell people that if the food has a bunch of shitty ingredients in it, there's a good chance if you eat enough of it, you're going to feel like shit.
Sure. Yeah. And the way I see it, I used to have a different view when I started grad school because I kind of got taught it's evidence-based or bust. Everything else you should strongly dissuade. And, if you tell a parent or yourself, an adult where you're coming in and you're like, I'm thinking about maybe eliminating sugars and processed carbohydrates and getting some more veggies in there. Like, I think that'd be good for me. And you're like, no, that's not wrong. You need to do medication or therapy. That's it. And like, who responds well to that? It's like, I'm trying. And that's always, I started to shift my lens to, all right, these people are wanting to do something good for their kid. It's not like they're trying to do something bad. And same thing if it's for you, you're trying to find answers and balance, is this going to be too hard to adopt this or too expensive in the case of therapy or medication? So, hey, I might try to do this. And my answer is always like, I think that sounds great. Improving your diet, certainly it won't hurt. And, we have these other options and they've got their pros and cons, but if you want to try that, I don't see any problem with it. Unless it's very clear to have a negative response.
The contraindication.
Yeah. If you're like, I want to do bloodletting, I'd be like, well, that's not, I would say no, strongly encourage no. And here's why, but yeah, that's much more of an issue in the, I can't remember what it's called. In the autism community, there was one that about chelation, pulling iron out. And it's like, no, you can kill people that way. So there are some things that I feel like we have an ethical obligation to dissuade, but other ones where you want to exercise more, but that's the only treatment we want to use. Okay, I guess. Like, some people have self-reported that's all they need. So maybe that is you. I don't know.
What are the things that you're seeing that from like anecdotally from your clinical experience really shows like a lot of people respond positively to it, but like from what like academics would say the research, there's research and then there's research, right?
Yeah.
Like, what is not yet supported by research that like just your lived experience as a clinician says like, if they actually do some good research on this, it will probably show that this is evidence-based.
That's a really good question because, for viewers who aren't in the getting training in mental health, you kind of get trained and this is how you do mental health. And then you go out in the real world and you go, oh, that doesn't work for people, for a lot of people. And so how do I balance the hard science? This will work. Like, people don't respond well to, let's say you have depression and I'm like, well, behavioral activation. So you need to increase your activity levels, do things that you're enjoyable. It's basically the equivalent of like, well, just smile more. And it's like, if it was that easy, I would do it, man. Like, so how do we build that momentum? And so I've been getting really into the work of, Maggie Sibley is big on this. She's actually worked with her in Seattle Children's, so self-disclosure. But in her parent-teen collaborative intervention, first and foremost, it is heavy front-loaded with motivational interviewing. And that MI component,
and can you define that just for listeners that aren't familiar with that?
Motivational interviewing, I can't even define it. But it's basically trying to make your values more salient, enacting change, like building that momentum of, I want to lose some weight. Grad school was not kind to me. And like, you're kind of thinking about it, but I'm not enacting it. So how do we get someone to consider making that leap? And there's ways of doing that. And what I've done with just about all of my adult clients is, first assignment I give is values clarification. What do you truly value in your life? So there's plenty of exercises online that anyone can find. I found one where there's a 50 card sort of 50 different words. So whether that's world peace, humor, family, generosity, genuineness, knowledge, and you slowly narrow it down to your top 10. And then, so we have a really good substantive conversation of like, it gives me an insight into you. So it's helpful for me. And I think a lot of people find it personally helpful in kind of clarifying, oh, this is who I am. This is what I stand for. This is what drives me. And then talking about, okay, what are we acting in a way that's not aligned with those values? So I've been neglecting going to church for the last year, and I get a lot, like that community there seems to really do something for me. And so then when we're working on organizational strategies, It's not just, okay, be more efficient at work or school. It's how can we get more organized so we're doing things that are aligned with your values? And I find that little bit of,
That's
I'm
huge.
tailoring this to you. And it helps build that momentum of, I've been neglecting this. And because I enacted this system, I'm doing this things that's more personally fulfilling now. So I think that's one that the MI or the motivational interviewing, values clarification stuff, I think there's a lot more work to be done there.
Because I know for when you have ADHD, if you don't have a strong, compelling why, like
Right.
it is hard
Yeah,
to
the
activate on the
why.
what. Like the why
Yes.
is that's where the fuel is the why.
Yep. And a lot of people who, and I've done therapy too, where it's like, I want to fix this now. And it's like, slow down. Let's really clarify and make sure we know the why. Like we know what you want to do, but the why is what gets people to move.
Well, right now, what we want to do is take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll just pick this up where we left off. So we will be right back. Support for this podcast comes from ADHD Rewired's award-winning online coaching and accountability groups at coachingrewired.com. It is the group to foster personal development, a curious mindset, and meaningful connections, because no one should be on their ADHD journey alone. Put simply, we believe in growth through community. If this sounds like the community you've been looking for, then we invite you to visit us at coachingrewired.com. Get your name added to our summer interest list. Once you get your name on that interest list, keep an eye out for an email and keep tuning into the podcast every week for when we announce our summer registration kickoff events. ADHD is real. We know there are days when it can seem like we're going through life on hard mode, and it's even worse when we feel like we have to do it alone. But in ADHD Rewired's coaching and accountability groups, you won't have to face your challenges alone. So if you want to join us for our summer coaching groups, then we encourage you to take that first step by going now to coachingrewired.com and add your name to our summer interest list. We'd love to have you. That's coachingrewired.com. Support for ADHD Rewired comes from Adult Study Hall at adultstudyhall.com, the virtual co-working community built for adults with ADHD who want to get more done and not have to work alone. Join us at adultstudyhall.com, where you can utilize the power of real-time accountability using our weekly guided and facilitated sessions, which we call ASH Plus, or our 24/7 drop-in room that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's only $19.99 a month, and it's free for the first week to try. We have our themed and guided sessions for cleaning and cluttering, writing, finances, for working out, creating, and even weekly check-ins. Then we have our career-focused weekly sessions led by our very own coach, Kat Hoyer. If you want to join the virtual co-working community created just for us, then we'd love to have you. Go now to adultstudyhall.com to get signed up. It's free for the first week, then only $19.99 a month after that. Learn more about all of our Adult Study Hall sessions by going to adultstudyhall.com. That's adultstudyhall.com. All right, we are back. All right, so we were talking about some of the work that you do and some of the things you're looking at with research. Are there any other areas around where the research maybe isn't there yet, but your clinical experience has shown you things that are promising or are probably would be supported by the evidence?
I don't think there's anywhere else that's just completely overlooked, but maybe it's nation. It's at the very beginning of kind of people understanding how important a factor is. I think one might be interventions delivered digitally. So whether that's telehealth is some model of that, or companies that are kind of Uber for therapy of like BetterHelp and things like that, where there's pros and cons of that, but it's potentially addressing a need that's not otherwise being met in our current healthcare system. Otherwise, kind of tacking on with the diet, just health behaviors in general, sleep, exercise, the stuff that It's the first thing to go when stress goes up, or like people with ADHD, it's like, all right, I just have to work harder than other people. And usually the first things to go for just about everyone is sleep, exercise, diet. And they have delayed effects where, okay, I can do that for a while, but we don't get that learning signal as quickly of like, oh, well, that's a problem. Sleep, we can be sleep deprived for a little bit. I normalize that for some college students I work with, and yeah, sleep is important. And there's a balancing act here. It's finals week, and maybe it would be worth it for you to get up early and refresh on that stuff at the expense of losing an hour of sleep. And then physical activity, physical exercise, same thing. It's just, we'll lose that. We'll become more sedentary as we get older. That's just a common trend.
Can I ask you specifically about the sleep and college students?
Yeah.
So I often will suggest to clients that like when stuff is becoming like real stressful or you got a lot more on your plate, to actually double down on the stuff that's self-care related.
Ooh, yeah.
Because I've done just a ton of time tracking, including like how long things take me when I've had a good night's sleep and when I haven't had a good night's sleep. And it's like almost always, I'll actually be much more efficient with a good night's sleep. And
absolutely.
But it sounds like maybe you're saying with college students, it's more situational.
I'm saying when it comes to like finals week or like big, just there's nothing you can do. You've got 5 tests this week. You're a pre-med major, like whatever that situation might be. It's like normalizing, you may not be absolutely on your best. It's like when I work with people who are like constantly burned out, I think this is very common I've noticing with ADHD. Maybe that's something actually, is I feel like a lot of ADHDers, they get into young adulthood and that fuel from procrastination, that adrenaline, it works. And that's the thing is, that's one of the toxic parts about it. Mm-hmm. It's worked for the past 18 plus years.
Right.
And now you're in college where those executive function demands go up. You don't get any more time in a day. And you're trying to live off this fuel, but every day you're trying to live off this fuel. We weren't designed to do that. Yeah. We physiologically cannot do that. And that's one of the ways I describe burnout for some people I work with is, yeah, it's worked for you. That's been your fuel. And it's just, you're empty. Your body can't run on fight or flight mode 24/7. It's not designed to. Things break down. It's not good. So, gosh, what was your original question?
I don't know.
But yeah. But you're asking about like sleep and stuff though. Yeah. So normalizing on some level that it's okay if, your exercise routine isn't at its peak, but also remember the value. Like there's nuance in the middle, Okay, you missed going to the gym today so you could join that studying group. Would you have studied otherwise? Probably not. Like, okay, well, maybe that was worth it. I tell people when they procrastinate, give yourself permission to procrastinate because everyone does it. But if you do it intentionally, do it mindfully. Okay, what did I say I was going to do? What am I going to do instead? So if I had a friend who got snowed in at the airport, so they can't make it out and I haven't seen them in years, and I was going to work on a report tonight to get ahead of things, I might leave that report to go spend time with my friend because that's a big value of mine. And I could look back on that decision and be like, no, I'm happy with it. We don't want to get to that place where, I keep making these quick, immediate decisions, not really carefully considering it and doing it intentionally and mindfully. And then those days later, I'm like, oh, why did I do that? Like, why? I shouldn't have done that. I wish I wouldn't have done that. Oh, I always do this. Like, we don't want to do that. Like, give yourself permission. And if you did do it in error, that's okay. We're learning from it.
Sounds like, if you are going to cut some corners with self-care, like know the cost. Just know the cost.
Yes. And that's always I've started talking about this more with patients, particularly college students, adults who have kids and a job and retirement and a mortgage. How am I supposed to manage all this? It comes more relevant to think of your time in a day is finite. Your energy in a day is finite. If you're adding something to your plate, always ask yourself, at what cost? What am I going to remove? Yeah. If you had excess space, that's a different conversation. But there's a lot of times, especially with ADHD, of like, exciting new opportunity. Yes, I will totally help with that project. And then afterwards, why did I volunteer for that? And it's like, so I encourage people.
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah. And it's like, I want to come off as motivated, engage, especially an early career person. It's like, you can still do that, but also show that you're thinking about it carefully. Like, this sounds really exciting. It's such a great opportunity. I want to make sure I look at my calendar to be sure that I've got space for this so I can really help with this, because I want to help you guys knock it out of the park if I've got room. And so it gives you that space to self-reflect. Do I have room for this? And if not, like, okay, what are the costs going to be? And am I okay with that?
So there's a lot of nuance in this.
Yes.
Which I love playing in
answer.
I love playing in nuanced spaces because it's like, you know, if there was a simple answer, like you wouldn't need to ask me the question in the first place.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting when I look back at my own college and grad school experience, I mean, especially grad school, where holy crap, like my average night of sleep was about 2 hours. Like, and yes, I got a 4.0 in grad school, which at the time was like one of my like,
humble brag.
The reason I say this is, you know, at the time that was like a huge accomplishment for me. But like, as I started to learn more about self-care and the role that takes, it was basically when I get introduced to Brene Brown and you know, she punched me in the gut by telling me that, you know, productivity is not a measure of our self-worth. And I was like, wait, what?
Says who? That's not what I've been told all my life.
And
it was school, at work.
Yep.
Like,
and it was that moment where I was just like, oh, I think I did grad school wrong. And if I could go back in time and do it all over again, I think I would have been okay with not as good grades, because I learned meditation during grad school because I was like freaking the fuck out every single day with like panic attacks. And it's like, okay, well, it's one thing to be highly motivated and like results driven and just, you know, but again, at what cost?
Yeah, to be fair, that's also one reason I left academia is just I still love research. And so when I left, that was one thing I wanted to make sure, how can I still fulfill this value of mine? And so I can do that with Jessica's channel, working with app developers, creating CBT apps for ADHD. But it's just academia is relentlessly critical of everything. Like there's always more, there's always somebody who's better than you. And some people thrive in that. And I did for a bit. And I think I just got to a point where I was looking at what the rest of my life would look like. And I was missing my family. I was missing my friends. I was missing going to the gym guilt-free, not thinking about all the millions of things that I should be doing right now, and being able to just end my day and say, that's enough. And in academia, it's a breeding ground of not having that. So,
well, let me ask you this. For someone who's listening, who maybe is considering going into academia.
So presuming you have an ADHD brain, so I'm going to speak to that lens. If you're doing that, make sure you love it. And that's the thing is when I look back on the times where I was really crazy stressed, but it didn't feel like it. So for example, my dissertation where I was doing an exercise study, it was very nuanced. It was exciting. Not a lot of people were looking at it. And I was like, oh, I'm going to be the first one to be doing this interesting study. And I'm learning about kinesiology, and I'd be working in the labs on the weekend and I loved it. You know, friends, we'd be at a bar Friday night and I'm like, oh, 9 o'clock, like, gotta go to bed. They're like, you are the lamest person ever. And I'm like, okay. Of course they meant it in a playful way, but finding that thing you truly love and like, don't forget it. Because there were times I felt like when I hit a stride in grad school was when I embraced the suck. Like it was just, this is a grind, but I did it today. And I remember how hard I worked just to be considered for grad school and how grateful I am for PhD programs. You know, I got paid to get a PhD. What an incredible privilege that is. I get paid to nerd out on things that I love, to help people. What an incredible privilege that is. And so when I could finally sit with that, and maybe that's different for whatever industry you might be in, that's where I just felt at peace and good.
You know, it's interesting. I often say that, you know, folks with ADHD, we don't have the luxury of just doing the 9 to 5 just for the money, right? Like if we don't love what we're doing, if we're not interested, if we don't feel valued with what we're doing, our brain like finds other ways to make itself feel good. And it usually has bigger repercussions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned when we were first talking was that some of the work that you do, you're trying to kind of help people balance this idea between you're trying to help support your patients and not coddling. So Talk about that,
Yeah.
that dance a bit.
I mean, so this one comes up particularly when I'm working with teens and parents and teens.
Okay.
And so parents will often describe it's like, well, because usually they're at two ends of the spectrum when they get to this age where it's like, I'm throwing my hands up, forget it. I'm disengaged. I can't deal with this. I guess they've got to learn someday. And the other end is kind of like the quote unquote helicopter parent of like, I need to micromanage every second because if I let my eyes off of them, the world crumbles. And so what we try to strike a balance to, at least when I work with parents of teens with ADHD and with the teens, because this works for them too. They want autonomy. They want freedom. And at the same time, you're a teenager. You're not ready for that. Like you can't pay bills. What are you doing, man? No, like I don't feel like I was an independent adult until my mid 20s. Truthfully, like the idea that you're 18 and you're ready to fly is silly for most people.
Yeah.
So for adults, it's like, all right, how can we support your teen without coddling them? And how can we give them some slack on the rope, but not let them drown? Let them make mistakes, but we want them to be reasonable. You don't want to be bailing them out of jail. And now they've got a felony record. Those are things we don't want to learn, but also realizing if you give them slack on something and they mess up, maybe there are some things that's okay. It's really not that big of a deal. They got a C in their class. Okay. What do you think you freaking out is communicating to them? How do you see them responding right now? Like that is their value, is that grade. And maybe, they asked for an opportunity to not have you over them like a hawk on homework assignments and they learned from it. And maybe they want to come back like, all right, I tried that. Can we get a little bit more support? Okay, great. Like we want people, the way I talk to parents is like, we want, if your teen's going to make mistakes, you want them to do it now before they're a legal age adult. And, maybe they moved away from you. Maybe they're in college and because of FERPA, it's kind of like the school equivalent of HIPAA. You can't do anything. If a parent contacted me when I was teaching, I would say, I can't even confirm or deny that your son or daughter's in my class. Like I can't comment on anything unless you gave some kind of consent, but that's another thing. This is a relatively safe environment for them to, get some bumps, scrapes, learn from it. That's okay. But if we're at either ends of those spectrum, the just kind of like hands off, they'll figure it out. It's like, oh, no, they won't. Or the really on top of them. And then they go off to college, for example, and all the scaffolding is pulled away. Your professor does not care if you show up to class most of the time. Things go off the rails real quick. And it's hard to recover because they haven't had an opportunity to learn that, to practice those skills.
Do you think it's important for college age students, if they're coming right out of high school, to maybe either take a gap year or start in maybe a year of community college? So their mistakes aren't so expensive?
Yeah. So for a lot of college students, I talk about 5 years. I'm only 32, so I'm not that far away. But, when I was in my early 20s, I was like, man, a whole other year. I went straight from undergrad to grad school. And in hindsight, that was stupid. I didn't need to. I would have been way more competitive if I took a year off, worked in a lab, or just enjoyed life a little bit. And it's really not that big of a deal if you can afford it, of course. I understand there's, financial constraints. So adding an extra year so then you can just stick to like 12 credit semesters instead of trying to murder yourself throughout.
That is how I did. Like my freshman year, which I almost failed out of, which is how I learned that ADHD in the first place. I was doing 15 credit hours each semester and I couldn't do it. And so from my sophomore to my super senior year, I did 12 hours and like my parents, they were like, you can just take one more class. I'm like, no, I really can't. Like, I'm literally like 12 is my capacity. I am like working my butt off.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there's the 5-year thing, something about, so you're not just drowning yourself for those 4 years. And then you look back and you're like, I couldn't,
what just happened?
Enjoy because it's also a social experience. Like it's a big part of college. So, I mean, there's that part. The other one too, is looking back, I got lucky. Most people, I think, change their major 3 to 5 times in undergrad. So the idea that we look at an 18-year-old and are like, hey, we're going to sign you up for 6 figures of debt. You're going to know what you want to do for the rest of your life, right? All right, now just sign right here. Great. Let's get going. Like I try to normalize that for teenagers and their parents too, of, you're supposed to know what you're going to do for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
And maybe becoming an electrician, like being a mechanic, I'm on my feet all day. Like maybe that's what you want to do. You want to explore music. You just want to take a year off. Like what's the harm in my eyes? I think there's this a lot of people say, well, what if I don't come back? What if you don't? What if you don't?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. Maybe it's not all it's chalked up to be. And as far as money goes, I know electricians that make bank,
Yeah.
welders, trade jobs that don't require that much schooling, that you can be done in a year, 2 years, and do something that fits your brain more, instead of, well, now I'm going to be sitting in a cubicle crunching numbers all day.
Right. It's like, do those trades and then maybe take a business class or something,
Yeah.
And it's like, get yourself a night. Exactly.
So I'm totally for just, what's the rush, man? You got so much life ahead of you. And boy, wouldn't it suck to take on, let's say you finish a year or two, you've got 40 grand in debt, and now you're dropping out because you're like, well, that wasn't right for me. And you still got to pay for it. And you have no paper. Like,
yeah.
Boy.
Yeah.
So take your time. You don't need to know, and it's okay.
Yeah. And even just allowing that your brain to develop more,
It's not until, 25, 26 that your brain reaches full maturation.
And then at like 30, the working memory capacity is going down. So between ages 25 and 30, of like these prime 5 years, and then then we're all screwed.
Yeah. Now I'm experiencing that other end. My body's decaying.
You're old age of 32, huh?
I'm sure there's some people rolling their eyes like, listen to this 32-year-old. Get the hell out of here.
All right. So looking at time, I want to take one more quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about some complementary and alternative approaches to managing ADHD. This is kind of a topic I've sort of intentionally have steered away from because of just the lack of credible science behind it. So we'll get into that right after the break. So we will be right back. If you like ADHD Rewired and want to stay up to date with our show notes and weekly episodes, then subscribe to ADHD Rewired by going to adhdrewired.com/podcast or hit that subscribe or follow button in your favorite podcast player. And if you love the show, don't forget to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast player if your app allows. While you're there, check out all of our other shows we have on the ADHD Rewired Podcast Network by going to adhdrewired.com/podcast network. We have ADHD Essentials with Brendan Mahan, Hacking Your ADHD with Will Curb, and ADHD Diversified with MJ Siemens. And did you know that you can join me and the rest of the ADHD Rewired team every second Tuesday of the month for our monthly live Q&A? That's every second Tuesday of the month at 10:30 a.m. Pacific, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. And you can register to join us every month on Zoom by going to adhdrewired.com/events. Discover more from ADHD Rewired by going to adhdrewired.com. Find this podcast and all of our shows by clicking on the podcast tab at the top of the page. And to join our monthly live Q&As, click on the events tab to register so you can join us every month. That's adhdrewired.com. Thanks for listening. Support for ADHD Rewired comes from our patrons. If you want to support the show and grab some extra perks, then I invite you to join us on Patreon by going to adhdrewired.com/Patreon. And thank you to Yadir M. and Robert C., who joined us this week by becoming patrons. Thank you so much for your support. You can get ad-free episodes of the show starting at just $5 a month. At $25 a month, you can join me every fourth Tuesday of the month for our patron-only monthly coaching calls. Our next monthly coaching call is today on Tuesday, April 26th at 3 p.m. Central. That's today, April 26th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And at $10 a month, you can get the audio recording of our monthly coaching calls delivered to you in a patron-only private podcast feed. I am grateful for any contribution you are able to give, no matter the pledge. Your support helps me pay my team. It covers editing costs, hosting, and equipment. Now, the average monthly cost to produce this podcast is around $800 a month. And the more support we get from patrons like you, the more we can expand our impact and reach more people in more ways. So if you are in a place where you can give a couple bucks a month, I am really grateful for your support. It really does help. And if you value being a part of this community and you learn about your ADHD through listening to the show, what is that worth to you? Would you say it's worth at least a couple dollars a month? Maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe more? If ADHD Rewired would go away, think about what you would pay to bring it back. Patreon is kind of a funny thing because I'm asking you to essentially pay for something that you can get for free. while trying to incentivize you with perks like ad-free episodes and recordings of exclusive coaching sessions or a seat at our monthly coaching calls on Zoom. And you can get more bang for your buck by getting 1 month free when you choose to pay for 1 year at a time instead of going month to month. Or whatever you are able to do, we appreciate you, and I appreciate you so much for your support. Become a patron today by going to ADHDrewired.com/Patreon. Just go to ADHDrewired.com and click on that Patreon button. That's ADHDrewired.com/Patreon. And thanks. All right, we are back with Dr. Patrick LaCount. All right, so let's talk about complementary and alternative approaches.
Yeah.
What is this woo-woo bullshit? Come on, what is this?
Right, I know. So recently I've been working with a team at Seattle Children's and Ohio State and Penn State, someone from Miami. We got a paper under review. We did a meta-analysis, which is basically a study of studies, where we tried to look at, okay, there's increasing attention among people with ADHD and in the general psychiatric community of people looking at stuff that's not traditional. So isn't therapy, isn't medication, like is kind of the general description of it. And so we wanted to do a review of, okay, like what are these things that isn't just, one paper on nutritional supplements. Like we wanted to do a comprehensive paper on all of them for people to reference. The big categories were nutritional supplementation, dietary changes, neurofeedback or cognitive training rather, physical activity, support animals was another one. What's the quality of evidence out there? Like you said, it's not great. So we had a certain threshold for studies to be included in the paper. That's standard practice for meta-analyses, and there's pros and cons of increasing that standard and lowering that standard. And we had a decently high standard.
And when you say threshold, like how many people are involved in the study?
Yeah. Did they
study
do
design?
Evaluations for ADHD?
Okay.
Is there a control group? Did they factor in medication? And the general takeaway that we got were, there's some evidence of nutritional supplementation, particularly omega-3s. Yeah, which is fish oil.
See, I saw a paper that came out a couple of years ago that basically said unless you have a specific like DNA marker, like that fish oil is kind of like you're wasting your time.
Not at least. So it'll give you the effect sizes. So when people say p-values in research papers, it's like, how reliable is this thing, this difference? And then effect sizes are how big is that difference? So the difference was relatively small. We would categorize that as a small, like maybe 0.1 is the Cohen's D on that. So it wouldn't hurt. It might have a little bit of a benefit, but it's certainly not going to get the same effects as what we see in medications, therapies, things like that. And then there's some promise for nutritional general dietary changes, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done in those. Cognitive training, the issue that we saw with that has been kind of plaguing that literature for a while is this issue of stuff not generalizing. It's near transfer versus far transfer. So
when you say cognitive training, you're talking about like CogMed.
Yep, CogMed. And then there's like neurofeedback stuff, looking at alpha and beta waves, theta waves as well. And so that we kind of collapsed them, at least in one of our papers, as the same. They are distinct, but for that purpose, we did. The issue that we found is the outcome variables. So we required that people were blinded, that the raters were blinded at pre and post, because, if I know my kid is receiving something, I might be noticing that, oh, wow, they are improving for confirmation bias. There's a lot of reasons.
And just for listeners to know too, like blinded means like the person conducting the research doesn't know if the person that they're doing the research with is getting the actual treatment or a placebo. And then same thing on the recipient end for the person receiving the treatment doesn't know if they're getting the actual treatment or a placebo.
Right. And then even the raters, they don't know. So that's a double blinded design. Yeah. For all we know, we gave you some computer tasks that in theory shouldn't do anything. It's just some random task. And then we have the cognitive training program. And so what we find is, we'll find improvements on computerized tasks that are supposed to measure, let's say, working memory. The issue comes is when we're like, all right, but people don't come in to therapy to get an assessment because on this computerized test I perform poorly. It's, well, I have a hard time holding things in my short-term memory. I forget things a lot. Mental math is really difficult. And so it's like, all right, are there things that are more realistic in the real world that this working memory improvement generalizes to? And it doesn't tend to be there. And so it doesn't tend to generalize. There's near transfer, not far transfer kind of effects where it doesn't seem to yield fruit in the real world, which is where it matters.
I want to ask you about one more area of complementary and alternative approaches, and that's CBD and cannabis.
That was one that didn't get captured in our review. Highly skeptical, particularly anything with THC in it. Everything indicates that should exacerbate ADHD. So not huge on that. Although a lot of people do self-report that it tends to slow things down, which maybe that's ameliorating some anxiety and stress. Again, we're not great self-reporters. So maybe I'm feeling better, but I'm not actually more productive or wanting to do the things I actually want to do. Maybe I'm overstressed. Yeah. So yeah, I certainly discourage people from cannabis use as a means to manage their ADHD in any capacity. If it's prescribed for, pain management, we have that in Colorado, for example. That's another discussion. And there's nuances to that because, all right, obviously you have this chronic pain, and how do we balance that with ADHD? And do we work with your doctor on any of that? And then CBD, I'm not aware of anything either, but that's also what makes that stuff difficult is we couldn't research it for a while. And, regulatory agencies are loosening up. So psychedelic medication, not medications, just psychedelics, I suppose. I'm sure they'll make them a medication at some point. But who knows? Maybe LSD for PTSD will be this profound thing for people. And same thing, maybe cannabis.
Yeah, the research on that, on hallucinogenics with PTSD is really, really profound.
Yeah, whether it's that not so much ketamine. I mean, that's a whole other thing, but or ecstasy, MDMA, what's psilocybin. Yeah, all those things. It's interesting. I'm not terribly knowledgeable in it, but it's an exciting new area that obviously need to be cautious about. But I'm excited to see that, okay, the regulatory agencies that are loosening up and like, well, let's at least study it. So people are doing it.
And that's also what I tell people too, like, there's not a ton of really good research that's been repeated. I tell people look, if you want to smoke pot, go smoke pot. But if you're doing it to try to manage ADHD, let's explore some other options.
Yeah, that's very, very skeptical of that. Open to new evidence, but yeah, and that's the thing is in the absence of scientific evidence, people will self-report. They'll have their own clinics where they specialize in psychedelic assisted therapies, and which can be biased because my only sample is my success people. Usually those that don't like it don't come back. And so I'm more likely to be biased and, well, no, this works because I have a clientele that show up, and it's like, well, that's not good research. That's not how we critically evaluate this stuff. So yeah, that's the thing is when we don't have people looking into it, it opens up that, and people are wanting answers. Like, how do I make my ADHD better? I don't tolerate meds well, or I just don't like them. Therapy is too expensive or time intensive. There's no good therapists in my areas. What else can I do? I get that all the time. What else can I do? I'm like, well, there's some other stuff you can do, but I wouldn't expect things to change drastically. And I think that's, again, try to empathize with people of that desperation of society tells me I need to be productive and I'm not. Society says I need to behave in this neurotypical way, and it's so hard and I'm tired. Can you just fix me? Like, fix my brain? And it's like, a lot there.
Dr. Patrick LaCount, thank you so much for spending the almost hour with us here. Any final thoughts you want to share?
Boy, embrace your values. Let that be your compass. That's it.
All right. Dr. Patrick LaCount, his website is practicalpsychservices.com. Where you can find out more about him and his services. We'll post that link on this episode's show notes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
My pleasure. Thanks. This is Eric Tivers. Thank you for listening, and congratulations for making it to the end. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. We are a community focused on learning, growing, and connection. The website is ADHDrewired.com. You can find time-stamped summaries and additional resources for each episode. Apply to join our free and secret Facebook community. Learn more about our award-winning intensive online video-based coaching and accountability groups. Join the Adult Study Hall virtual co-working membership community. Find all the other podcasts on the ADHD Rewired Podcast Network. Sign up for my email newsletter to get exclusive content that you won't hear anywhere else. And use the search tool to find episodes on specific topics. You can do all of this at ADHDrewired.com. While you're there, click on the Patreon button. If you are a regular listener, consider making a monthly contribution by becoming a patron. If you are able to financially support my work, it would mean a lot. This show is free to you, the listener, but it's not free to produce. Plus, patrons get cool perks like ad-free episodes and access to recordings of coaching calls, and $25 a month patrons can join me once a month for a group coaching call. You can follow me on Twitter at Eric Tivers. You can like our Facebook page at facebook.com/ADHDrewired. If you're a coach, therapist, or related professional, connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/Eric Tivers. Subscribe to ADHD Rewired on YouTube to see selective interviews and other videos I've made. Podcasts change lives. You can make a difference in someone's life by spreading the word about this podcast. Mention it in your online communities on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or wherever you hang out online. And be sure to share it with your friends, family, your therapists, your coaches, doctors, siblings, parents. And if you, your coach, therapist, doctor, or ADHD support group leader would like a pack of podcast postcards to hand out, you can request those at the website, ADHDrewired.com. If you are a member of CHAD, ADA, or any other ADHD support group, please be sure to tell them about this show and all the shows on the ADHD Rewired Podcast Network. You can even show them how to download it on their phone. And if you really loved this particular episode, please hit share on your podcast player. I'm only one person, and I do count on you to help spread this message. One of the biggest things that you can do to support this podcast and help other people discover it is to leave an honest rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other app that supports reviews. And don't forget to hit subscribe so new episodes are automatically pushed to your favorite podcast app. Looking for more ways to listen and learn? Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at Audible by going to audibletrial.com/ADHDrewired. Here is my list of must-listen-to audiobooks updated July 2021. Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. Attached by Amir Levin and Rachel Heller. Atomic Habits by James Clear. The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. Crucial Conversations by Carrie Patterson. The Coaching Habit by Michael Stainer. The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Rest by Alex Sujong Kim Pang. The 5-Second Rule by Mel Robbins. Make It Stick. The Science of Successful Learning by Peter Brown. The Productivity Project by Chris Bailey. Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics by Dan Harris. Change Your Questions, Change Your Life by Marilee G. Adams. I always recommend to my coaches and admin that they read that book. The One Thing by Gary Keller, a required reading for all of our coaching group members. Procrastinate on Purpose by Rory Baden. The 4 Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. And if you're looking for something a little bit more magical, I have fallen in love with the Harry Potter series, and the narrator, Jim Dale, is amazing. And of course, if you haven't yet boarded the Brene Brown bus, all of her stuff is great, starting with Gifts of Imperfection, Daring Greatly, Rising Strong, and The Power of Vulnerability. And if you're an entrepreneur or leader, be sure to check out her book, Dare to Lead. Do you have something that you would like to share? Click on the podcast tab at ADHD Rewired. Click the button to be a guest at the top of the page and schedule a 15-minute interview. This is Eric Tivers, reminding you to keep learning, growing, and connecting. Self-care is not selfish. No matter what you get done or don't get done, you are still enough. And no matter how hard it feels, we can do hard things. And we don't need to do them in the hardest way possible. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next week.